All right, Stephanie, here we are, finally. I appreciate it. I'm so excited to chat with you. For anybody who is listening, this has been a long time coming for me. I've been following you for a while, and it was one of those like classic social media things where, I don't know, mutual friends, whatever, we just sort of find each other. And I'm like, I love everything you're doing. I love the messaging. I just love what you're about. And I knew we would have some good conversations. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on and chat with me about some things.
Well, let me tell you, I am tickled that we're doing this because, as you mentioned, it's been a minute.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of things going on, and I am so excited to be spending the next however long it is, however many minutes, hours with you today.
I have a feeling maybe we're going to do this more than once, but we'll see what we get through in this chat. Before I get into kind of some of the more like specific questions that I have for you and like discussion topics that I want us to dive into, I would love for you to just kind of give our audience just a little bit of like the elevator pitch of who you are and what you do now. Like, what does your day-to-day work look like today?
Sure. Yeah, it's actually changed quite a bit. So started off for 16 years, I was in private practice as a doctor of chiropractic. So did the whole private practice, the functional rehab, the movement and kin, and all the things that come along with being a chiropractor, and fell in love. Even actually before I was accepted into chiropractic school, my undergrad, I was doing neuroscience and psychology. Those are my two majors in university, and just had this love affair with the brain. So chiropractic, of course, is the study of the neuromusculoskeletal system. So it's a really nice pairing. And so spent a lot of time in practice, started running nutrition programs without getting into the whole backstory of, the philosophy of chiropractic. We look at things from a physical perspective. Obviously, you might see a chiropractor for headaches or low back pain or movement, aberrant movement mechanics, whatever it is. But there's also a chemical component to that. So that might be diet, that might be the medications that you're taking or not taking, the supplements that you're taking or not taking. So we started running nutrition programs in the clinic, very quickly noticed a difference in prognosis between men and women. So I was running a ketogenic program at the time in the clinic, and men would just drop it like it's hot. It was just like a week in and they're like, "Doc, this is the best. I've lost 10 pounds." And, his wife would kind of walk in, head, tail between her legs kind of thing. And like, we're eating the same stuff. I've adjusted for calories and I've lost a pound. This sucks. I feel my menstrual cycle is this way. And I feel like, my mood is dropped and I can't sleep. And so anyway, started changing the way that we were doing the program for men and women. It started bleeding into, pun intended, the way that I practice as well. So I would start to change the way I was adjusting patients and rehabbing patients based on where they were in their cycle. We'll get into why that is, I'm sure, as we get into it. And then, after 16 years of being in practice, I think not all doctors get there, but I certainly sort of reached a point where I felt like I was limited to the geography of where I was practicing. So I was practicing in downtown Toronto, Canada, and just wanted to reach. I mean, we had people kind of driving in from sort of the neighboring cities and stuff, but just wanted to reach people on a bigger platform, specifically with nutrition and female-centric practices. So in April 2019, closed the clinic, went all in for online, started a podcast, all the things, and sort of leads me up to where we are today, which is primarily my work now is centered around the podcast. I am an eternal learner. So I absolutely love prepping for shows, as I'm sure you do as well. Just, I know that a guest is coming on. I want to learn everything about their body of work for my audience, but also selfishly for myself. And then currently, at the time of this recording, the nutrition program that I had sort of put out, it's in need of a bit of a zhuzh. So I feel like it's incomplete at this point for women at different points in their life. So when I had originally written the program, it was primarily focused on women in their fertile years. So those women who were still cycling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we need to also put in a caveat for perimenopausal women. And then there needs to be sort of like a section, if you will, for perimenopausal women, another section for menopausal women. And then on top of that, if I'm being honest and open and transparent, I don't want it to just be nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
Nutrition has been a huge part of my life, my whole life, but so has fitness and rehab and movement mechanics. And I want to integrate fitness into and exercise and rehab and prehab into the program. So that's kind of my dream right now, is to sort of relaunch that within the next year. So I'm starting to work on that right now.
Okay, very cool. The timing of your kind of switch was very fortuitous. When this happened, were you like, I mean, of course it was stressful anyway. Were you like, maybe this actually worked out like real well when you think about it?
I am so grateful.
Yeah.
Actually, what had happened was my landlord approached me because they wanted to buy me out because there was a big spa that was coming into we were in an area called King West. If anybody knows Toronto, it's sort of like maybe a bougie sort of, area. And there was a spa coming in from Spain, and he wanted to take over my lease. And I was already feeling that pull to close down the clinic anyway. So it was just really great timing. And then, 9 months or 8 months later, I guess the pandemic hit. So I feel very fortunate, because it would have been an awful predicament to not have been open, because chiropractors were unfortunately not considered essential workers at the time. So I dodged a huge bullet, and I am grateful for that every day.
Yeah. The movement mechanics side, I feel like we could have like a whole separate podcast about, and it's something that I'm personally struggling with. So I might just like bug you about it later.
Yeah. Already there's a part 2, and maybe we'll have you. So I also just because I'm saying this to your audience, you need to come on my show as well. So we're going to figure out after we're done, you'll come on my show and we'll talk.
Yes, I appreciate that. Okay. So before we get into, again, you covered a lot of stuff just there, and there are some things I want to ask you, but I've made some notes here of some things that I want to chat about. And yeah, the research your guest thing, like I've been in this podcasting game for a while. We both have good podcasts that I think people like trust and respect. And like the amount of times that I have either been a guest on a show or I've been listening to other people where it's like, it's extremely apparent that the host doesn't know anything. And I'm just like
hasn't even opened the book that the authors.
But they're not even like trying to fake it. They're not even like, so anyway, on page 62, they're like, yeah, so you wrote a book, right? Did you write a book? What's the book? And I'm like, dude, like, give me a break. Like, anyway, that kind of stuff pisses me off too. So
totally.
I'm with you on that.
It's so funny because in podcast prep, of course, you listen, I read the book, or I'll listen to other people's podcasts to sort of see what the main talking points of the author have been, so that I can, we can kind of get those over with in the beginning, and then kind of get into some like juicier stuff. And you're right. We won't name names, but there's a couple of guys out in the podcasting world that they just sit down and they're like, so what's up?
So tell me, Tell me,
what's your name again?
Yeah. And to your point, like I feel like I literally at this point podcast to learn, and it just so happens that great, I get to share it with other people and they get to learn too. But it's a labor of love, podcasting and writing books, to be completely honest. You got to really want to do it, because it's not always the easiest or most direct road,
They're both like birthing children. I think it's like they're long game plays, right? So I think with the podcast in particular, this is a very long play. I likened my first book. You have a couple of books under your belt. My first book really did feel like I was laboring a child. So, you're pregnant with the idea for however, many months or years that you have the idea and this conception the concept that you have. And then there's the conception, and then you're writing, and then you're rewriting. And then it comes time where you have like the deadline, your editor's like, it needs to be in here. And then the editor goes through it, and there's moments where it's fast and furious. And then there's moments where you're sitting at the computer, your eyes could be bleeding and nothing is coming out. And it just kind of, for me, it was very analogous to birthing my child, because there were moments where it was like fast and furious and there's dilating and everything's happening, and then nothing. And then you're like, all right, I'll take a lap around, it's like walk around the corridor, and I'll get my husband to massage my sacrum, and I'll do some breathing exercises. And then it's like fast and furious again, and then nothing. And finally the baby's here, the book baby. And then you sort of have to get, you go right on into, as a mother, you go right on into whether it's breastfeeding or full on mom mode. And then when the book is sort of finally here, it's like you're doing podcast tours and you're doing, so for me, it's very, very analogous to a child.
I would agree with that and add on to it that, yeah, to your point of like what comes after the birth, it's like we spend so much time focusing on like, get the book written, get the baby here. And then you don't think about like, oh, this is my life now. I have to like be with this book or this baby. It's like all the work comes after you write the damn thing and it's out there in the world. But anyway, it's funny because people ask me, I don't know how you feel, but they're like, oh, would you write XYZ book or another cookbook? And I'm like, I'm not.
It's the same with children. They're like, so you can have another one?
I'm good. My hands are full with what I got right now.
Yeah. But yeah.
Okay. So one very kind of specific question that I wanted to ask, because I just feel like this could be a spicy conversation. In your book, The Betty Body, you mention why morning routines are sexist. And let's just dive right into it. Dive right in. Talk to me.
Yeah, this came from sort of years of frustration as a podcaster, but also even prior to as an avid podcast listener, listening primarily to, and even I would argue, even to this day, some of the biggest podcasts are, at least in the health space, and I'm sure that this transcends other categories, are men. And that's not to say that the men that are sort of at the top don't deserve to be there. Of course, they do. I would just like to see more females sort of included in the conversation. And what as a podcast listener, what I was hearing all the time is, you have to, every morning, you have to wake up at, 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. It's like, join the 5 a.m. club, join the 4 a.m. club. And it just seemed to get more and more and more ridiculous. And it was like, there's a picture, we're not going to name names, but there's, guys that would be taking pictures at 4 a.m, like sweat pooled all over the floor. And they're like, yeah, did you even work out yet, bro? And it's like, okay. So there's that. And it's like, and then you have to, have your journaling practice. And then you do that with this tea that you've imported from Japan. And then it's just all this stuff. And for me, you're in the throes of sort of toddlerhood, let's say right now. For me, for many years, my morning routine was my toddler kind of like toddling into my room and waking me up because I was so sleep deprived, either from breastfeeding or the baby had a nightmare or baby came into mommy's room overnight or, whatever it was. Right. So I always felt like I could never keep up with this standard of, morning routines are for high achievers. And I identify as a high achiever, but I also identify as a mother and a woman. So I wrote this chapter because I just wanted my hope. And anyway, my intention was to have a little bit of shock value for people to be like, what does she mean they're sexist? And also to give women permission to sleep in for a variety of reasons. One is that we are typically the primary caregivers in the home. We sort of take care of the bulk of unpaid work, right? So we go to work, we make bank, and then we come home and we're doing the laundry and the cooking and the soccer schedules and the, taking care of sick children, et cetera, et cetera. Not that men don't ever do it, but just primarily that those roles and responsibilities typically fall on the female. And then the other thing is women actually require more sleep than men. This is something that's also not, women are often excluded from studies, but some of the things that we know now is that women have a longer sleep cycle than men do. Sometimes up to 30 minutes. So if you go through, we understand the regular sleep cycle to be about 90 minutes. So if you go through 3 or 4 or 5 cycles of that over the course of an evening, over the course of a night, and a female is going to have somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes longer, and she's sleeping in the bed with a male who's probably going to wake up earlier than her for either his morning routine or just naturally, she needs a little bit more sleep than he does. Couple that with pregnancy, couple that with the physical labor, the chemical labor of giving birth to children, and it takes years to sort of correct that. We're kind of at a disadvantage. And you hear these well-known, well-respected podcasters talking about how morning routines are the way to set you up for success. And it often leaves half the population feeling like a bunch of losers. So at least that's been my experience and what has been communicated to me by my community, which is primarily female.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of why I wrote the book was, yeah, like morning routines in general are sexist. If your morning routine one day is that you go downstairs and you find your way to the coffee machine and you get the coffee, you press the button or however you make your coffee and it's made and that's your morning routine before you start. Like some days that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel extremely seen and I have a lot of things to say. First of all, does it even count as sleeping in if you were the one who got up 4 times in the middle of the night to breastfeed and deal with the kid? I mean, you're not even sleeping in, you're just trying to catch up, first of all. Second of all, to your point about the podcast situation, I think one of the tough things is that we still, as a culture, when we see, the typical 38-year-old white male fitness podcast host, whatever, the avatar, we kind of think of that person as they could very well be an authority figure and we inherently kind of trust what they have to say. And when we see a woman, we think, okay, that's women's issues. That's women's issues. So of course we might still be interested in hearing that podcast, but to get so large, to get to be the top 2 or 3 podcasts, you have to appeal to everybody. And even if our podcasts appeal to everyone, people still consider, because we look at whatever the issue is through a female lens, that it's going to be a woman podcast, a female podcast about girl stuff, which is typically not as appreciated as it should be, which still is kind of false. I mean, both of our podcasts are geared towards women, but I know that I have male listeners. I'm sure you do too. And we cover topics that are not only relevant for all genders, but also would be good information for men who have women in their life to know.
It's like, it's for the women and the men who love them. Like how much of an unfair advantage is a guy who understands, let's say, cycles or the changes that happen in perimenopause, or what an unfair advantage you have on the dating scene. Just saying. Yeah.
And I mean, my podcast is more geared towards, again, sort of strictly like nutrition and health information for women who are looking to improve their health. And so a lot of coaches find their way to this podcast. And dude, like male coaches, you need to know this stuff. If you're dealing with women clients, you need to understand women's bodies. It's like, this shouldn't be like a specialty thing anymore. That part of it sucks for me. But
and like, stop if you are a male coach or a female coach, stop putting your clients on 1,200 calories.
I can't.
Stop putting them on 1,200 calories and stop training them like men. Like, women don't need to build out their chest and their triceps. Like, we need, we want to, I mean, maybe that's a separate conversation.
We'll get to that actually. I have a note about that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah. And like, that's the other thing too, is that we, again, as the other, which in a world where there are 50% women, we are still kind of considered like a specialty case when we're dealing with women's issues. But we look at all of these things, health and nutrition and wellness, through the lens of women, but also the larger world. So we know how men's bodies work generally, and we also know how women's bodies work, hopefully. Men and the men who are running these huge nutrition sites and these podcasts and stuff, they don't have to know about us, because they can still kind of speak to men and they can sell programs and sell plenty of programs to women. Again, I don't want this to be like a throwing people under the bus, so we're not going to name names.
We love men, by the way. Like I have sons, like we love men.
I'm surrounded by them. Great. And also, there's a very large more fitness podcast out there that they have some fitness programs, and the amount of potential women clients that come to me that say, I got this program from this group. And I'm just like, what about them made you think that they were talking to you? Because they in no way cater to women or women's experiences or women's needs or goals or whatever. But because they're big, because they're popular, women are like, well, I guess, this is trusted. This is what I should do, instead of trying to find the client or the program or the coach or the program or whatever that is actually geared towards them. And then
what does that woman do? What does that woman do when that program fails her? Does she say,
they failed?
Exactly. They don't say, hey, maybe the program wasn't designed for me. They say, what's wrong with me? Why can't I ever make anything stick? There's something inherently broken about my constitution that makes me unable to adhere to this program that has been set out for me.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, it's funny that you're like, I love this kind of morning routine of sexist thing because my co-host Rachel and I, we literally just did an episode where we were talking about the 75 hard, this challenge.
Oh yeah, which should
Um,
never be done by women, but
anyway,
okay.
right. But like
Yeah.
people don't want to hear that. And people will
Yeah.
bristle against that. And like, well, why can't I do it? I can work hard. Women can work hard. Yeah. I mean, arguably we work harder,
100% you
but in
can.
different
Yes.
ways.
Yeah.
And also like, the getting up at 4 and leaving a sweat angel, like, is that moving you in the direction you want to go? Yes, it might feel like you worked hard, and yes, you may be exhausted afterwards, but is that supporting your actual health? I mean, I just had a potential client reach out to me today, and she was super, super upset and frustrated because she is 3 months postpartum and unhappy with how she looks and feels, and is talking about she's exclusively breastfeeding and talking
Gosh.
about how she wants to restrict some food or think about how she can get. And I'm like, my friend,
It's like, Mama, where
yeah,
does this voice come from?
please just give yourself a
Mm,
break, right? And it's
mhm.
so difficult to like embody that and hear it, but I mean, I really feel like my biggest gift that I gave myself, and I had the luxury and the ability to do this as like an older mom and in a job that was a bit more flexible. But postpartum, I was like, there is no part of me that is trying to bounce back and get abs and go back to the gym immediately. Zero part of me is trying to do that. This is a different phase in my life. This is a time when I'm focusing on a different kind of physical goal and spending time with my kid. And there was literally zero part of me. And this is somebody who has spent my entire adult life in the fitness industry and caring about what I look like and spending all of my time focusing on my own health. And I was able to switch like that to like, I don't care what I look like. I mean, of course, I'm going to take care of myself, but my goal is not how fast I can bounce back and be myself again and be in the gym. My goal is like learning this new life and bonding with
Mhm.
my kid and taking care of my kid. And I just wish that
What
more
a healthy
people,
attitude. I wish more people, yes,
right?
sorry. Yeah.
And
Hmm.
how can we, this is one of my whole like reasons for doing my job is to try to help women like really hear it and really feel it. Because the tricky thing about it is that it's like the Bruce Lee, like slow is smooth and smooth is fast. If you actually kind of slow it down and care more about the foundational, like, let's nourish my body again. Let's try to manage the stress. Let's try to get the sleep. Let's try to move our bodies in simple, easy ways first, you actually end up in the long run getting back to where you want to be probably quicker than if you try to bust your ass 12 weeks postpartum.
100%. I think there's also a panic. There's sort of an
Yeah.
underlying, to your, to the point about the client that reached out to you today. I think there's almost this underlying, like, oh my God, am I going to look like this forever? Like, I have to
Mm.
do something about it right now. And I think that there's a little bit of, in the same way that when we're injured, if you have an injury, let's say, it's like, is this pain ever going to go away? Is it, I think that sometimes our experience of pain is the anticipation of more pain rather than
Mm.
the actual signal itself. And I think there's maybe a comparison there to be made when someone is not at a weight that they want. It's like, oh my God, am I going to be here forever? Like,
Right.
is this my new thing versus what is a far more balanced, far more loving and nourishing approach, which is I'm just going to move I've made a human. I know that it's simple word, but I have made another person. So there has been a huge physical ask of me. My hips have separated. My abs have separated. My organs have moved all around the place to make room for this child. And I have passed this baby, for those of you that have had vaginal birth, I have passed this baby through my birth canal. Um, yeah. So there's a big physical ask, there's a big chemical ask, right? Like all your nutrients, like we know that we see leaching of calcium, we see leaching of all of our nutrients as pregnant women go to the baby. And of course, the emotional and spiritual, it's like there ain't no hood like motherhood,
Mm.
It's
My goodness.
one of those places where you are constantly worrying, am I making the right choice? Am I doing the right thing? Is this for my own ego? Is this my own trauma patterns that I'm now passing forward to my child? Like all this stuff is all like
Hmm.
ever present. So just
Yeah.
can we just slow it down a little bit? And I think that we don't have to talk about Hollywood. I'm not a huge fan of sort of some of the precedents that's set there in terms of female, you have celebrities who have chefs and they're starving themselves and and they have all these different, resources that are available to them. And then we see the post baby, the 3 months, look at her, she's got abs and she's, with her twins or whatever it is. And all I ate was an apple. I had apple and fish for two. I had one apple and one fillet of fish for 6 weeks and
Nightmare.
that are 12 weeks. And that's how it's like, okay, well, you didn't breastfeed. And you've leached, like it's been way more stressful. It'll be way more stressful. And I would argue more deleterious health consequences down the line when you treat your body like that.
Yeah. I mean, their life is not our life. So to try to compare it is ridiculous from the outside. But even from a common sense approach, what on earth would lead us to believe that something that took 10 months to form and then, come out into the world would just be fixed in 3 months if we just kind of restrict our food enough? It's just wild. But anyway, that is a rabbit hole we could go down, but I think it was
worth mentioning. Yeah. Mentioning for the ladies who are listening and maybe struggling where you are right now.
Yes.
We see you.
Yeah. Yes, we see you and we feel you. But I think that one of the areas I want to talk about a bit more, because you have more knowledge in this area than I do personally, and it is something that comes up so often with my listeners, is talking about how to optimize your fitness and how good you look and how good you feel as you enter sort of your 40s, perimenopause, that whole deal. And I've done some sort of foundational research and some, I'm trying to do some work on my own because I really am trying to help support my clients and kind of have these conversations. But women in their 40s are stressed out and overworking themselves and confused and I feel like the vast majority of the clients and the women that I'm talking to are of this mind of just like, oh, what I'm doing isn't working. I'm just going to grind and do it even harder. And then it keeps not working. And then they just keep grinding harder. And, so often my very basic response is like, okay, let's just take it back a notch. Let's just think about sleep. Let's just think about going for walks. Let's think about eating enough food because you're eating 900 calories a day. Whatever. And it's so difficult. It's so difficult for them to even try it, right? It doesn't have to be this hard, right? Talk to me.
Yeah. This is where I love to geek out. So I think that there's a couple things happening for women in our 40s. I would say from a metabolic perspective, from a hormonal perspective, from an environmental perspective, in terms of life stressors. So let's start maybe with hormones, like sex hormones in particular. So prior to 40, and I would even argue kind of starting mid 30s, we do start to see some changes in our sex hormone concentration. Usually in our 30s, it's not enough for most women to really notice it. But one of the first changes that we see with our cycle, if you are measuring regularly, which by the way, highly recommend for you to be getting lab work done if you can, at the very minimum of once a year, but once every 6 months is ideal. But what we see is starting in mid to late 30s, we start to see a very gradual and steady decline in a hormone called progesterone. So progestation, that's the pro-pregnancy hormone. It shows up in the second half of the cycle. So once we ovulate, you have to ovulate in order to produce progesterone. It doesn't just show up because you're on day 16. you have to ovulate, which is maybe there's some complexity in there. But let's assume that we have a woman who's ovulating. We see progesterone starting to rise in that third week, and it reaches its peak around day call it 21, 22 for extrapolating to a 28-day cycle. So about, end of week 3, beginning of week 4-ish for most women. But in our 40s, we start to see that hormone decline. And in our 30s, we might not necessarily notice it. Although there are some women who are like, yeah, I really feel my body changing. I'm 38, I'm 39, I'm 40, I'm 41. In our early 40s, the consequence, let's say the hormonal consequence of having that progesterone steadily decline year over year is now in that second half of the cycle, post-ovulation. We can run, the layman's term is estrogen dominance. It's a bit of a misnomer. What it really means is that relative to progesterone, we have more estrogen in the luteal phase of the cycle. But that's a really big mouthful. So we often just say estrogen dominance. And what that means, of course, is estrogen has 2 big rises in the cycle. There's one big rise in the follicular phase before we ovulate. And that needs to happen for about 50 hours. It's developing the follicle, et cetera. And then it drops off right before we ovulate. And then there's a secondary but gentler rise in the luteal phase of the cycle, the second half of the cycle. When our progesterone is not as high as, or doesn't rise higher than our estrogen levels do, then we can start to get things like raging PMS. So this is extreme moodiness, sleep disturbances, inflammation. So a lot of women will describe, like, if they're trying to put on their rings, like they have so much water retention, they can't fit their rings on, let's say, or like jewelry that you might put on your hands. Some of your beautiful jewelry might not be able to fit.
Nice plug. Thank you.
You're welcome. By the way, just as an aside, I love those earrings.
Thank you.
Barbell earrings, they are so nice. I don't know if I should do this, but I sleep in them because they're so okay. I sleep in them and they don't bother me. And then I can just go to the gym and I already have some jewelry on. Okay. So back to
appreciate you. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So your rings are not fitting. And then you're just generally, I described it. So in the Betty Body, I talked about my own sort of difficulties with estrogen dominance. I described it as like angry breasts. Like my breasts felt like really angry with me. T-shirts, putting anything kind of over the areola area, very, very tender and hot. So you might start to notice that. The other problem, of course, with that is when estrogen goes unchecked. So progesterone kind of keeps estrogen in check. So as we see progesterone rise in the luteal phase of the cycle, we will down-regulate the estrogen receptor sensitivity. And we also just downregulate total concentration of estradiol. And this is important because we want, like, kind of the golden rule of estrogen is use it and then lose it, right? We don't want estrogen. There's certain metabolites of estrogen, which we won't go into. But for the geeks that are listening, I'm talking about 4-hydroxyestradiol and 4-hydroxyestrone. These retain the ability to activate estrogen receptors in the breast, and they shut down the ability for bone to remodel itself in the skeletal system. So this is kind of a really bad. You never want cell proliferation and division unchecked in the breast, right? For women. And then you also want the bones to be able to remodel themselves, especially as we get into our 40s, where we start to see even though I've been talking about sort of a lower progesterone, estrogen also starts to kind of come down as well. So we have these, estrogen is an anabolic hormone. It's involved in, as I mentioned, cell proliferation and division. We want our bones to be able to remodel themselves, and maybe we'll talk about osteoblasts in class on a different time. But basically, when we are leaving estrogen unchecked, we are shutting down osteoblasts, which is the bone cells that are involved in new bone, like these are the bone cells that are involved in cell division. And what happens as a net result is over time, we have more osteoclastic activity. So it's CL, osteoclastic, which is breaking down. So we are breaking down more bone than we are creating. That's a problem. That's a problem for women. So that's kind of spelling out osteoporosis down the horizon. If you sort of like take it all, if you sort of, extrapolate a long delta, that's, we're talking about osteopenia, at least initially, and then eventually osteoporosis. So that's sort of one of the primary things that we start to see in our 40s from a sex hormone perspective. From a metabolic perspective, there are many things, but one of the most important things I think to highlight is that naturally we become more insulin insensitive as we age. Now, there are many reasons why this happens. One of them, which I'm sure you talk about a lot on the show, is a loss of lean muscle mass as we age. If we are not careful, if we are not strategically, at least I would say doing some sort of calisthenics, but ideally resistance training, we are losing 1% of lean muscle mass per year, starting in our 40s. And it's, some argue like kind of starting when that progesterone declines, like mid 30s. So over the course of your 40s, you can lose 10% of your muscle mass. And then, it continues if you're not doing anything.
And so if I could just interject really quickly, for a lot of women who were never encouraged or never directed to build muscle when they were younger, you're starting with not a lot of muscle to begin with, which can also be really...
think of the women who are in their 40s now. We all sort of grew up. We all grew up in this like high, let me say it right, high carb, low fat, sort of era. And then
aerobics.
it was like aerobics. I was a step teacher. That's how I paid partially for chiropractic schools, like high-low, Taibo, if anyone remembers that, step aerobics. Like it was all about aerobic training. And even though I've lifted weights my whole life, I also wasn't lifting heavy. I wasn't lifting heavy when I was in chiropractic school, or, I've really, it's really only more of a recent phenomenon for me, like maybe in the last 10, maybe 15 years. Okay. So we have this insulin resistance. Okay. So that means that you are going to have more plasma. So insulin is basically, for those of you that don't know, it is a hormone that drives, it takes substrate from the plasma and then pushes it into the cell so that the cell can now utilize, it's usually glucose. It can also be amino acids, free fatty acids, but it's primarily amino acids and glucose. It pushes it into the cell so that the cell can now make energy. So if you have a lot, let's use glucose because it's the easy one. We have glucose sort of circulating in the plasma, in the blood, and your pancreas, which is where insulin is made, it's going to say, "Oh, there's glucose here. Okay, so we're going to increase our insulin output." And if you are in your 40s and you have low muscle mass, let's say you haven't, as you were saying, you don't actually have a lot of muscle mass to begin with. There's going to be a bit of insensitivity, in particular, starting in the muscle. We know this from some of the work of Dr. Gerald Schulman, demonstrating that insulin resistance actually starts in the muscle. So it is the muscle's inability to acquire glucose and then store it as glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, because the muscles will take the glucose, phosphorylate it, and then they don't allow it back into the system, right? So it's the muscle's inability to acquire and store glucose. That's the problem. So you still have this sort of systemic output of insulin. And now all of your cells, and I would argue particularly your liver, is now being exposed to very high levels of insulin. And what happens? Well, then we start to get systemic or global insensitivity. And where this becomes very dangerous, of course, is when the liver now is exposed to high levels of insulin. The liver has to do something, right? So there's lots of plasma glucose, there's a high insulin environment, and now we start to see the development of something called NAFLD, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's not just the liver, it's all the organs, but NAFLD is the one we sort of want to hone in on, because the liver is a really important organ for metabolism, for function, for life. And you'll also start to see a change in your lipid profile. So the liver is going to start outputting higher levels of triglycerides, higher levels of VLDLs. I hate the word bad cholesterol, but just, kind of more inflammatory, more easily oxidized, let's say, lipoproteins in the blood. So the other thing that a lot of women notice in their 40s is a change in their lipid status. Like for maybe their total cholesterol or the LDLs or their triglycerides or whatever was fine in their 20s and 30s. And now we have this muscle loss. We have this insulin insensitivity. And now we have this sort of accumulation of fat. And a lot of women will actually complain of weight redistribution in their 40s and 50s, where they'll say, I used to be packing it on, like I used to have a lot of junk in the trunk, like I used to have a lot of weight in like my butt or, lower tummy or thighs or whatever. And then now we start to see this like central adiposity, right? We start to see this kind of midsection accumulation of fat, which for a woman is abnormal. Like women under the influence of estrogen, we should, even though we don't like it, but we should be putting fat. We should be more pear-shaped, meaning that we should be kind of a bit more bottom heavy than sort of apple. I'm using air quotes if you're, like apple shaped, if you will, like more thick through the midline.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the metabolic. That's one of the major metabolic changes that we see. And then the last thing, which I think is really maybe the most important thing, which is kind of driving and making everything worse, is her environment. So in your 40s and then certainly in your 50s, I like to call this like the stress sandwich. So we have like pressure from above, where we have aging parents. Now that we are taking to doctor's appointments, maybe we're noticing there's some dementia, they have more pills that they have to take, we're kind of taking care of them. And then our children, if we've chosen to have children, we have pressure from the bottom. So now we have, I'm in my 40s, I got some teenagers, that are God, I love my kids more than anything, but they have mouths on them. And they think they know everything. I'm like, it's so amazing that you, as a 13-year-old, know
Know
more
so
than
much.
me.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
God.
so I'm so grateful that you know more than me. So, my kid, so you have like this kind
Oh,
of pressure. I honestly feel like the parenting gets far more complicated in their teen years because now they have these outside sources, like whereas you when they're 2, 5, 7,
it's
you're
just
sort of the
me.
primary
Mhm.
influence on them. And
Mhm.
then when they're teens, they want to hang out at the park, they want to go to the mall, they want to go out with their friends, and there's this outside influence that you don't have as much control over. So I think that environmental pressure um also can contribute. I mean, this is like a high stress environment, right? So you can't eat, you can't move, you can't do the things that you were doing in your 20s. Like you may have fasted, or done aggressive fasting and super cardio and all the things in your 20s, and maybe that helped you manage your weight, or maybe that helped you, achieve whatever goal you were trying to achieve. It doesn't work in your 40s.
Yeah.
You got to change the plan. So I know that I've spoken forever. I'm sure you want to dissect some of that.
Yeah.
That's kind of
Okay.
that's sort of the overview, let's say, the quick and dirty of what's happening for a woman in her 40s.
Well, that was a master class, so thank you. I'm like my toddler adult brain is just like trying real hard to like hold on to everything and get the questions that I want to ask you, but thank you for that. I think one of the big like high level takeaways from this is for women listening to understand that what they're experiencing in their 40s, 50s is probably very common. You are not alone. And a lot of this is physiological, biological processes, as opposed to you doing something wrong or your body being defective. Our bodies are hormonally and in other ways more complex, and they go through more stages and changes and ups and downs through our life cycle. And instead of, again, this very feminine trait of saying something's going wrong, it's my fault, I'm bad, everything I'm doing is wrong, or I'm weak, or I'm not doing it good enough, or whatever. Instead, if we can just take a step back and through education and through understanding, learn to work with the changes that are inevitable in our bodies instead of railing and fighting against them, I think we will all do so much better. So it sucks sometimes to hear things like, look, these hormonal changes are going to happen and they're going to have an impact on you. And here's how we mitigate it. It also might suck for people who have spent 20 years doing CrossFit workouts every day to be told, maybe that's not what's best for you anymore. But I think, again, it's like we have this tendency to just fight it, fight it, fight it instead of like,
There's a lot of white knuckling.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, do you have any recommendations for how we can take this information and this reality and again mitigate the negative side effects? And if the answers are at a very basic level, you need to eat more protein, you need to eat more food, you need to spend more time on recovery and sleep and stress management, you need to honor your cycle rather than fight against it or ignore it. If those are some of the basic, recommendations, how do we get people to hear it? Spoken from a frustrated coach, how do we get people to hear it and do it instead of just say, that would probably work for other people, but I'm going to continue to eat 1,200 calories and do CrossFit workouts every day?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, as someone who's coached several women, it's the question that I will often ask, and it's asked with love, is how's that working for you so far?
Mm-hmm.
How's that been working for you so far? You're
Yeah.
miserable. You're putting on weight through your stomach. You're not sleeping anymore. You're screaming at your husband or whatever, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
situation is. Um, and I would hope, for the clinicians that are listening, for the coaches that are listening, that hopefully you've built up enough rapport and
Mm-hmm.
trust with this woman that you can say, why don't we just try? Why don't we just play? Like, can we
Mm-hmm.
lean a little bit into play for a moment? That's another thing that I think maybe it's a separate podcast altogether, but how can we embody play, joy, childlike wonder? But can we just play a little bit? I know we have this very rigid thing that you're following. Um, and from what you're telling me, it doesn't seem like it's working for you. So why don't we just try something? And if I'm wrong, we'll go back to the 1,200 calories and the one egg and the 4 hours of cardio and the, whatever it is. I
One
had I had a
egg.
woman, I had a woman one, God bless this woman. I had a woman, she's like, I have one egg. That's my breakfast. And I was like, okay, we got to talk. Like,
Yeah.
we got to talk. She's like,
Yeah.
and I don't know why. And I don't know why I'm so hungry. I'm like, how many calories do you think are in an egg?
My goodness.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, so
Okay,
we,
what are your thoughts? And I know again, this could be I'm just trying to touch on so many big topics for like 2 minutes, but like HRT, is
hmm,
this something that I mean, I believe from what I know of it, it should be less stigmatized and more talked about with women's health than it currently is. But is it something that you would think of as maybe a last resort once lifestyle factors are sorted out? Or is it something that probably should be more common in terms of women's health maintenance as they enter their 40s and 50s? What are your thoughts on, hormone
oh, this is
replacement
a
and
huge topic. Okay,
yeah.
so this is a great question. I'm so happy you asked it. So I would say I would say first I'm a fan of HRT. So I think that it is absolutely there are a lot of women who are unnecessarily suffering, and part of it actually the majority of it is because we had this absolute, dare I say, junk science um, study called the Women's Health Initiative
Mm-hmm.
um, that manipulated data that had. I actually just did a solo episode on
We
this. I
did
don't know.
too.
Oh,
we're
did you?
we're vibing, okay?
We
Because
are
we
vibing. Yes,
literally
that's
just did
awesome.
this. Yeah.
So, what was so infuriating about, I mean, there were many things that were infuriating about the WHI, but
Mm-hmm.
it primarily was the cohort that they chose. So it was like the subjects that they studied, they were, 65, the average age, I think, was like 65, 63, 65. So a full 10 years after the average age of menopause. I think, oh, God, I forget the numbers. I had it all prepped for my solo, but it was like 50% of them were smokers
Yeah.
and then 60% of them were obese. So it's like if you could create the perfect storm for a cardiovascular event,
Mm.
you would have a smoker who was obese. And then, of course, we know age is a big factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is men typically, I mean, that is by the way, cardiovascular disease, number one killer in women, not breast cancer, not any other, nothing. It's cardiovascular disease. And in some cases, it's more of a question of when, not if.
Mm-hmm.
We are protected from heart disease through our fertile years under the influence of estrogen. Estrogen has many um, sort of makes us metabolic superheroes in a way. And so we do see cardiovascular disease happen later in life in women, but there is a sort of almost like a 10-year kind of phasic shift, right? So we see the onset of CVD in men is around kind of 50, 55. And for women, it's like 60, 65. So the cohort was just, it was a ticking time bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, which is, I want to say almost unbelievable, but unfortunately it's true, is that they didn't include subjects who were symptomatic. So I just want to, I know that that sounds ridiculous, like she's making that up, but it's like we wanted to study an intervention to see if HRT would help ameliorate some of the symptoms of menopause. And yet we excluded women who were symptomatic. And when I first read that, I was like, that can't be right. But
Make it
that's
make
what,
sense.
make it make sense. Exactly. Make it make sense. And that's unfortunately what happened. They excluded women who were symptomatic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the reason why I go off on this little tangent is because they had, sort of had this biased cohort, this,
Study.
vertical
Yeah.
of women that is going to already give you some bad results. There were several revisions after the fact, but I think it was 2001 or 2002 when the original sort of report came out. And they said this needs to be stopped. It's, increases myocardial infarcts by, I can't remember the percentage. And then this sort of sent shock waves through the medical community. And this is probably why, and it still exists today. Unfortunately, like we're in
Mm-hmm.
2023 at the time of this recording. So there will be women that are listening to this that have spoken to their primary care provider about hormone replacement therapy because they're suffering from hot sweats, they're hot flashes, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
They're sweating through the bed at night, like they're completely soaking the bed. Even just more subtle changes like affect, like we tend to, with that sort of drop in estrogens and testosterones, more likely for more anxiety and more depression. Of course, reproductive challenges like sex becomes very painful because we're not lubricating as well as we should. clitoral sensitivity, anorgasmia, like all this stuff happens. Okay. And a lot of times the answer for women is like, well, sorry, chickaboo. It's like, that's
This
what
is what
aging is.
happens.
Yeah, it's what happens. Right.
Yeah.
So you still have this sort of perseveration around HRT being dangerous. Now, certainly, of course, there's going to always be out, like if you've had breast cancer, or you've had, there's like sort of an individual analysis that needs to happen with you and your primary. But I would say that HRT, all that to say, is I'm a fan of HRT. I think it's stupid and ridiculous to think about longevity and health span if we're not considering. I like to master in the masters. So I do think that lifestyle is important. So you need to get your nutrition right. Like you had mentioned, increasing your protein. You do need to be resistance training. Things have to change in your 40s. Stress management, as you mentioned. And I also think that there's a place for HRT. I think that will help so many women. I mean, if you can't sleep at night, how are you going to train? I mean, I know that I've had bad nights, and transiently I may be able to punch through a workout, but I can't do that all the time.
And if your libido's gone and you're depressed and you're not sleeping and you're gaining weight weirdly when you have never had this issue before and you're 42, that's a long way to go.
And you're being told
crap.
It's all in your head, or this is aging, or here's a script for, God, the pill. I've had women in their 50s been given the script for the pill. I'm like, are you effing kidding me?
Unbelievable.
Another rabbit hole, maybe for another time. Or SSRIs, they're put on antidepressants or antioxidant, like they're given anti-anxiety medication. Or, when I mentioned before, we see a change in lipid profile that might be put on a statin or something. So it's like, now you have all these other things that are depleting our minerals, making us feel like sometimes our menstrual cycle is really shitty. Pardon my French. I'm sorry. I don't know.
No, you're good. You're good.
Because we are mineral deficient or vitamin deficient. Sometimes replacing your B vitamins, you have a nice juicy steak or whatever, and you're going to feel better.
What are your thoughts, just very quickly, on the difference between bioidentical versus synthetic hormones?
Okay, so bioidentical, the name itself is a bit of a marketing term. Like, we're not harvesting progesterone from a crop somewhere. Like, it is still made in a pharmaceutical somewhere. I do think that there's a lot of data on Premarin. So that's pregnant mare urine, if I remember the acronym correctly. I think there's like 60 or 70 years of data on it. So it's relatively safe. I would if I had to choose, I would choose the bioidentical, still made in a pharma, still made somewhere in a facility, but I'd still choose the estradiol and the progesterone that is bioidentical over progestin any day of the week. Although there is a lot of data to suggest that it's safe. I think that the other sort of component why I would choose bioidenticals over sort of more of a synthetic version is we see, at least progestin, we do see depletion of CoQ10, we see depletion of B6 and B12, we see selenium and zinc, and all these sort of minerals are really depleted with it. And there's some research to suggest as well that it does also change mood and affect. We've seen this with the pill, where it tends to, women tend to take more risk, like they tend to have a bit more risky behavior with it. I think that that's not 100%. Like, I'm not confident saying with 100% certainty. We know that that's true with HRT. I think it has a good safety profile to it, like synthetic progestin, but as just someone who prefers something that looks like, is an analog to something that I already produce, I would choose a bioidentical. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Is this something that might be worth looking into proactively? Not to say we need to start pumping ourselves with hormones when we're still kind of producing them naturally, but as somebody, for example, in their late 30s who is cycling normally, whatever, but I'm staring down the barrel of these changes, right? Is it a conversation that I might start to have early with a doctor? Or is it like you wait until, because I guess we're all going to experience this maybe at different times and maybe different severity, depending on, genetics and how we're taking care of ourselves. Is it something that you kind of wait until, because the issue, the struggle that I have is like, it's one thing if you like wake up one day and you're having hot flashes and you're sexual function's gone. And like, I know because I'm in this industry, I'm like, something's off. Let me go look at my hormones. But to your point, some people are like in their early 40s and they just suddenly feel shitty on a bunch of different levels. And they have no idea to even think that this might be the situation. And then they're years down the line struggling and suffering, and they don't know to ask their doctor about this kind of stuff. So like, how do we know when is the right time to start having these conversations?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have the answer.
Yeah.
I would say that it obviously differs from individual to individual. This is why I was saying, if it's available to you, get your labs done every 6 months. You
Right.
can monitor it yourself. There's so many companies that kind of at least sidestep sort of the gatekeepers. Sometimes medical doctors don't even want to look at it. They're like, we'll
Right.
talk about this when you're 55. So there's so many companies now where you can sort of just get the phlebotomist who can come to your place, or, there's kits that you can sort of order to your house and whatnot. So if that's available to you, I would definitely recommend that. I think my only, I guess the way, I mean, I think about this a lot because this is a really big question that that's in my community right now. And I think maybe this makes me a bit more conservative, but my safety mind goes to, if you start taking hormones, our bodies are not stupid, right? So they will now start to down regulate. There's negative and positive feedback systems in the body that in some ways we still can't predict. So if you're starting to take some type of bioidentical, you've ordered it off of Amazon, or maybe even if you're working with a naturopath or whatever, you're kind of stuck there, right? You're kind of stuck because now we have this down regulation in the system. It's kind of like the birth control pill in some ways, right? In that you are initiating a negative feedback loop to sort of shut down that brain ovarian axis. And I would argue that the same is also true with hormone replacement therapy. The safety profile, as far as I'm aware, it seems like within the first year of entering menopause. So again, I know it sucks. It's like a retroactive diagnosis. You need to go 12 months without a period, et cetera, et cetera. Seems to be the safest in terms of either alleviating symptoms and helping to have the woman sort of live a more vibrant, wonderful life. But that doesn't mean that you have to go through menopause. I have lots of colleagues who are already on progesterone. They're sort of mid to late 40s. I have women who are, even, you'll also know if you're starting to, like, if you have a partner, it'll become more apparent in terms of like lubrication, or like when you're intimate with them, sex becomes a little bit more painful. It sort of takes your desire, even just your general desire for connection with your partner starts to decrease. So even things like topical or I should say maybe transdermal estrogen, like where we're putting suppositories into the vagina, that is also very, very useful. So I think and that can happen before menopause. So I think that it is a conversation that you can have with your primary if you feel like they're open to it. And then, you sort of have to go on a case by case basis. We also, I'll leave it there because there's so many different nuances, like so many little details that I don't think I can accurately capture or that would be valuable.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I do want to briefly kind of touch on another stage, which is the sort of, well, I mean, I guess anything, the sort of reproductive stage. I do want to talk about this for a little bit. So I just want to close the loop on the kind of fitness and feeling good in your 40s and beyond, because we did talk about a lot of stuff pretty briefly. And I know, we can listen to your podcast and we can do this again to get kind of more deep on any of these particular topics. But to kind of close the loop, it's like, this is inevitable. Aging is inevitable. You're lucky to get there. These things happen. And the ways in which we can be sort of proactive and positive and flexible with our changing bodies and hormones and life is to listen to what our bodies are telling us and actually respond in kind rather than fight against it, right? Eat nourishing foods, work out in a way that is beneficial instead of beating us down. I mean, do you have kind of any other great and go now and enjoy your life kind of final thoughts for us? Because again, it is just, it is a huge, I think, hugely underserved market. And it is a group of women who are who are really, again, generally speaking, I think desperate and lost, but want to feel better and want to try. So is there anything else you can kind of just wrap it up in a nice little bow for us? They can feel like they've got some, no pressure,
action
but
items,
yeah,
some action items. I would say we've touched on a few of them, which I think are deserving of a sort of double underline, if you will, and a highlight, which is increasing your protein consumption. I would say at a very minimum, it's 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. I actually think that's a little light, but that's a good place to start. Generally, if you're eating, I can tell you what I'm doing in terms of protein. I'm actually consuming more than my body weight. I actually haven't done the calculation, but I'm consuming about 150, sometimes 160 grams of protein a day. So that's about 50 grams per meal. And that might seem like a lot, but I've said this on the show, like get in touch with your inner protein shake. Like just
do it. Just do it.
Get some protein shake and make a beautiful, I have this in the evening, I have this almost like dessert, like I'll put some cottage cheese and I'll like whip it up with some chocolate protein powder and a little bit of honey and a little, it's almost like a pudding. It's like, it's delicious. So I would say increasing protein is vitally important. I know that you'll hear a lot of people say like 30 grams of protein. I'll say at the minimum, 30 is good, 40 is better, 50 is best. For most people. Again, I'm painting a little bit broad strokes there, but 30 at the very minimum. If it can't, and your protein source matters. So at the risk, I think I'm talking to, I see the carnivore-ish diet behind you. Animal protein for the win.
Yes.
Partially because it's a multivitamin, but also in terms of protein, I mean, not all gluten is a protein technically.
Sure.
So we want to be thinking about animal protein for its rich content in leucine. That's why whey protein, if you're going to get in touch with your inner protein shake, you're going to make it a whey protein shake if you can tolerate that, or isolated beef, or what do they call it? Beef isolate, is that? Yeah. So that's another, some people who can't tolerate whey really do well with a beef isolate. So that would be one thing. I would also say, I've said you want to also spread the protein out over. You can't have 150 grams at breakfast and then just have olive oil for the rest of the day. Like you want to sort of spread the bolus out over the course of the day. And the reason for that, we didn't talk about this, but quickly, the reason for that is that we're trying to drive a signal for muscle protein synthesis, which I'm sure you've talked about, maybe even ad nauseum at this point. But when we're having a full, complete protein, you're going to be getting amino acids like leucine, which drives the muscle protein synthesis process, which is going to help preserve your lean muscle mass. So I would say timing, quantity of the protein is important. Lifting weights. There are so many free resources in terms of, a local gym. You don't even need a gym, honestly. At the beginning, you just need your body weight. You can do squats, you can do push-ups, you can hang off a doorway and figure out how to do a pull-up. And then as you sort of get more advanced, figuring out how to literally train your resistance, right? You want to be hard to kill. So you want to be lifting heavy weights. And I talk about this in the Betty Body in terms of how to cycle it over the course of your cycle. And then maybe figuring out stress management. I would say for most women, this is I like to get outside in the sun and I like to do some meditation. I have an app that I listen to. I like to do cold plunges. I like to do sauna. Like these are some ways that I find are very relaxing for me, or just taking a walk around the block after I've been sitting at the computer for, too long. And everybody will find sort of a different rhythm. Some people really love yoga. Some people will find joy in singing lessons, in a pottery class, whatever it is, but find something that brings you joy and that is a potent stress reliever in your life. Because I'll tell you this, no one at the end of your life is going to be like, good for you. You were stressed out 90% of the time. Here's your medal. You can die now.
You were hungry and stressed out your whole life. Congratulations.
Yeah. And that's not coming. So find a way to enjoy the time that you have. I think in midlife, we also start to contemplate our mortality. It's something that I start to think about. I think about it more than I ever have. I think in my 20s, I thought I was indestructible. And in my 40s, I'm like, wow, I'm halfway through. If that, if that, if I can get, average age for women typically 78. So I'm like more than halfway there if I'm going for the average. So find ways, find ways to enjoy yourself. In clinic, I would often find, and this is going to sound awful, but there were so many women. I was like, you either need to leave your husband, leave your job, or both.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and maybe that means you don't necessarily leave the husband, like, don't just
Figure it
run out
out.
and yeah, try to figure it out. But whatever the dynamics are right now are not working. So maybe there's therapy. Maybe you need to have a conversation that you've been avoiding, something. Because I'm telling you, all of that stress is just rotting you from the inside out. And, I mean, at least for me in my 40s, like my sort of boundary, like my level of tolerance for bullshit has gone way down. I used to tolerate all sorts of things, and I'm probably still tolerating too much if I'm being completely honest. But what I tolerate now as a 45-year-old woman is very different than what I would as a 25 or 35-year-old woman. So
yeah, it's like life is both too short and too long to live in a way that you are constantly stressed and unhappy and not doing things that are supporting your own happiness.
I love
right?
that.
It really is.
Too short and too
too
long.
long. It is.
God
Okay.
damn it. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. I can say something smart every half an hour. So I've got one more in me. Okay. So I want to go back to, you were talking at the top of this conversation and also just now, and you talk about in this in your book about training around your cycle. And I do want to touch on this because in my experience and in the work that I've done with my clients, with the foundational understanding that I have about the changes that happen in, normally air quotes, cycling women in reproductive age, I have always kind of tended more towards, and this isn't talking about people with PCOS or people who have like really kind of specific issues, for generally normally cycling women, I have always been of the mind of like, if you're cycling normally and it's not really a big, huge deal for you every month, and you don't have a lot of PMS symptoms, and it isn't really a miserable experience for you, kind of maybe we should be like not so adherent to training around what our cycle would dictate, and more just like, how do you feel? Like actually pay attention to your biofeedback.
Like auto self-regulate.
Right. Like if you
auto-regulate. Yeah.
If you wake up someday and you feel like $1,000,000, but your cycle's saying this is the week you should be taking it easy, like you should do what, feels good. Kind of like understand your cycle, pay attention to it. You should know what's happening, but you don't have to be like a slave to it necessarily, has kind of been the way that I normally approach it. I know that of course does change depending on where a woman is in her life and also how her cycle is. But can you just kind of talk, like take it to the next level? Like when and why does it matter to maybe train around your cycle? And how does somebody even kind of start looking at that?
Yeah. So I think that what you just mentioned should be step number one.
Okay.
Is this auto regulation. So can we check in before we're going to the gym or while we're at the gym and say, how does this feel? Maybe you've done a warm up, you've done some mobility work, and how am I feeling today? I would say as a general rule, more often than not, although of course, as you mentioned, there can be exceptions to the rule at all times. I have also experienced that myself, that in the follicular phase, the first 2 weeks, we tend to be more expansive. We tend to have a bit more energy, a bit more reserves to push it harder, typically. And then in the luteal phase, we tend to not have as much. There's a little bit more energy degradation, potentially more inflammation. We tend to be a bit more insulin insensitive, etc. So with the idea that you are going to check in every day, irrespective of where you are in your cycle, what I have noticed is for women who are on their bleed week, and again, there can be a lot of variability here. Some women, it's like orgasmic to get their period. It's like, thank God. Like now I'm just like done with all this bloating, and my boobs are feeling okay again. I get my rings back on, all this stuff. So some people, it's like such a relief and they're able to get back to the gym.
Pregnant.
I'm not pregnant. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I remember my gym teacher in grade 10, she's like, the only thing worse than getting your period is not getting your period. Right.
Amen.
I was like, that's so smart. And I've always remembered it.
Yeah.
Okay. So for some women, the first couple of days of their period is very painful, right? They feel very lethargic. They're very crampy. They're very achy. So again, self check in. And then when you sort of get into the swing of things, I typically will, because we start to see estrogen rising towards the end of week 1, and then it reaches sort of its apex at the beginning, like around day 10, let's say, of week 2, I really do like to push it in these 2 weeks. So I like to lift and I'll actually, let me just say it this way. I want you to be lifting all through your cycle heavy, like as heavy as you can. It's just the way typically that you lift heavy, we can modify that. Okay. So lifting heavy in the first 2 weeks of the cycle typically is anywhere between 5 reps. I actually love, like in week 2, like testosterone's high. I feel like I have all the energy in the world. Estrogen's really high, 5 to 7 reps. So I'm usually going for like a PR there on weight. In the first week, I typically will say like somewhere between, call it 8 and 10, maybe 12 reps there. Again, heavy. And you want to, at the end of your set, at the end of every set, irrespective of where you are in your cycle, you want to feel like if I was right beside you and I said, how many more you got? You might say like, I got 1, maybe 2, maximum 3, right? So we want like reps in reserve to be something like 1 to 3. So that might mean that in week 1, if you're doing 8 reps, let's say, or 10 reps, the weight's going to be lighter than you might do it in week 2, but you're still going to feel that fatigue or that approaching muscle, total muscle failure, or you don't want to get to muscle failure. That's not necessary, but you want to approach it. You sort of want to brush up against it. Where like RIR is what I just mentioned, like how many reps in reserve do you have? The other way of looking at it is like how hard was that? Out of 10, you want it to be 8, 9, or 10 out of 10, right? So that was like that set was really difficult. That was an 8 out of 10 for me. So that's kind of a way, again, to self-regulate, right? How hard was that? Can I go up? Do I need to go down, etc. In week 3, so after you ovulate, I typically will lift the same way that I did in week 1, so somewhere in that 8 to 10 rep range. And then in week 4, often women will report lots of water retention. They're not sleeping that great. They don't have as much energy. They're typically feeling a bit more inflamed. So I still want them going as heavy, let's say, as they can, but now the rep range is much higher. So it's like 15 to 20, sometimes even 25 rep range, reps if they can handle it. And I really like a higher rep range in late luteal phase because it's going to help reduce inflammation. I'm sure you've talked about myokines on the show before, which are these sort of anti-inflammatory modulators that are released every time the muscle is contracted. So the more that you contract the muscle, typically the better you're going to feel. And we really need that late in the luteal phase if you are someone who really does suffer from some of these PMS symptoms that we've been talking about. So all that to say, if you're someone who doesn't really know when her period's coming, you feel the same sort of all through the month, lift the way that you love to lift. There's many ways to skin a cat. Just approach muscle failure. So you want to be able to say however long the sets are, however long the reps are, that you have 1, 2, or 3 more left. And that's it. That might mean the whole month you're lifting 10. You're doing 10 sets and that's good for you. And that's fine. I would say for a lot of women who are in tune with their cycle, and that in order for you to be in tune with it, you need to track it. So any tracking, I use Clue, no affiliation. I just like them. I know there's others. I'm sure there's like I think wearables are now starting to ask if you're on your period and they're trying to predict things and stuff too. So whichever floats your boat. But I typically find in week 1 and 2, I can really push my sort of finite limit of matter, if you will. And then part of the justification behind that too, we talked about estrogen at the top of the hour. And I think this is a good time to bring it up here. Estrogen peaks, as I've mentioned, at around day 10, if we're extrapolating over a 28-day cycle. So, kind of the beginning of week 2, approximately, for most women. And estrogen has the beautiful ability to make your tendons a bit tighter. So the tendons are sort of you have the muscle belly and then you have the tendon, and that attaches to the bone. So this is actually a really great time to push it. Yeah. And this is actually part of the reason I would start adjusting differently in the clinic. I was like, where are you in your cycle? Okay, so we're going to do this kind of manipulation, this kind of adjustment here. And we're going to, oh, you're late luteal phase. Okay, we're going to do this kind of adjustment. So really good time to push it when the tendons are tight, right? And then we sort of see that kind of secondary rise of estrogen, not as high, but again, into that third week, again. So maybe it's not 5 to 7 reps, maybe it's 8 to 10, or however you see fit. But you can sort of push it again. You can push it really week 1, 2, and 3, and then week 4 is like almost like a deload week, kind of.
It's kind of great. It's kind of great to think about that and build it in anyway.
Yeah. So that's how I think about training for women who are cycling. Again, you might be in your luteal phase and be like, I am going to go for a PR today. I'm going to do my 1 rep max. And if you do that, kudos to you. That's amazing. You can do that too.
I think one sidebar I would give about the reps in reserve, because we do talk about this a lot on the podcast, is unfortunately, most people are really bad at understanding or knowing what that is. And I think it's probably better the more trained you are, the more you do this stuff, you kind of have a better sense. But especially in the beginning, and that we do tend to see stereotypically, it's like you go into a Globo gym and there are generally men half repping weights that they have no business touching. And then there are women doing 50 reps of 7 pounds all day long. It's not doing anything for them, but they are scared to lift a heavier weight. Like, again, generalizations, right? Of people who maybe aren't as far along in their journey or aren't getting the right education or support. Men are usually overdoing it to their detriment, and women are underdoing it to their detriment. But
sometimes I want to go into those gyms with a t-shirt that says full ROM.
Right? We need
full range of motion. Yeah.
We need to make a t-shirt, because the amount of times I've developed a pull-up program, because this is like a whole other side bar that we could go down, because I'm a big fan of upper body strength in women. I wanted to get into this with you because you did a post about this the other day that I really liked, that I wanted to talk about. But the amount of men that I see, these muscle-bound dudes who are just crushing quarter reps. And some people, I've made some lighthearted jokes about this on social media before, and people are quick to tell me that, people have mobility issues and whatever. I'm like, yeah, sure. But most of these guys, it's not a mobility issue. It's they are not training the full range of motion.
They take all the plates in the gym, and then I can't do anything because there's 30 45s on one side of the leg press and then 30 on the other. And I'm like,
thank you.
And then they bend their knees 5 degrees. It's like
5 degrees, dude.
And then everyone knows. It's like,
what are you doing? What are you doing? But so I guess, again, quickly, the reps in reserve thing is, I would just say, especially for women who, maybe are newer to this or are intimidated. And I don't want to tell, for safety and common sense reasons, I'm not telling people to go out and go lift the heaviest weight you can lift and just see what happens. But I think that, there was some study that I can't reference right now where they were saying they asked people to guess how many reps they could do of something.
I think Menno put this out.
Probably. And they would say I don't know, 12. And then when they actually were pushed to the limit, they could do so much more than they thought they could do.
I think it was a 40% underestimation.
Right.
Yeah,
which is
I remember that.
Massive. And I'm a very trained person. I've been doing this for a long time, and I still go into the gym and think I kind of want to stop at 8 reps. And then if I push myself, I can do 16 at this weight. This is stupid. So it's just sort of something to think about, especially for women. And if you do have a history of being I'm weightlifting, but I'm not seeing any changes. And it's are you really pushing yourself? Are you struggling? Are those last few reps hard? Not dangerous, not I'm dropping a weight on my head, but are they hard? Are they really hard? Or can you kind of move the 10th rep the same as the first rep? And it's something to think about. And maybe if you have somebody, a training partner, or somebody that you trust, or somebody who can come and help you and spot you, and really on a day when you feel you're willing to challenge yourself, really kind of test out what that rep range is and see. So you have a better idea of what your reps in reserve are, which will change from day to day and how you feel. But I just feel a lot of women are doing themselves a disservice because they've done this whole long journey of moving from chronic cardio to weightlifting. And then they're I'm not seeing all these changes you keep telling me are going to happen, because they're maybe not pushing themselves hard enough. And this is the thing. This is at the crux, I think, of body composition and muscle gain issues, is knowing truly. I hope people don't listen to this podcast and think we're being huge bummers, but how hard it really is to build muscle tissue as a woman, anybody, but especially as a woman, and especially as somebody who isn't maybe taking any like extracurricular, supplements, if you're trying to build muscle and you're not eating enough to even, maintain your body's processes, and then you're kind of like half-assing your workouts, and then you're stressed and not sleeping, and you think you're going to create new tissue on your body, it's insane. You have to work so hard.
And you have to eat.
And
I think you said something really important, that you have to eat. Yeah.
You have to eat.
You can't put on muscle. I'm sure you asked this question. Can I lose fat and
build muscle at the same time?
Why?
Why would you want to? Just do one thing right. Don't half-ass both things.
Like if you're gonna hunt two rabbits at the same time, like the likelihood of you getting both of them low.
Exactly.
Can we just chase one goal at a time? You can do it. You can, but it's orders of magnitude more difficult if you just say, I'm just going to go into a build phase. I'm going to enjoy my food. It's going to be 8 months to a year, and then I'm going to cut. And then you're going to see the changes.
And you don't have to gain 30 pounds of fat while you do that. That's the other misconception, is that to bulk effectively or to eat enough effectively, you have to gain all this body fat. Maybe you'll gain some.
Those are dirty bulkers. Like those are people that are just like, I'll just eat whatever.
That's a choice you made. Okay. Yeah. That's not the way it has to be. Oh my goodness. Anyway, we could just go so many directions here.
No, but I love what you said about the reps in reserve. I think some of that comes with putting in the miles. Like you just kind of got to get used to what your own limit is. I was talking to my neighbor the other day, and she was like, gosh, I love your arm. She's like, what do you do for your arms? And I was like, well, after I do shoulders, I have a hard time brushing my teeth. Like, I'm just going to say, and she's like, I'm so scared about injuring myself. Like, that's one of the comments that she made. People are so scared of injuring, so they actually stay away from it almost entirely. And it's almost like I'm quoting Lane Norton here, which I'm sure you're familiar with. He's been on my show. He talks about this idea of, the likelihood of a woman getting bulky, or you might even extend that to like injuring yourself from lifting heavier, is sort of like expecting that now that you drive a car, you're going to become a NASCAR driver. Right. And I really like that. I mean, it's sort of tongue in cheek and it's a bit shocking, as Lane can be, but I really do like that, because as a woman, like, let's just call a spade a spade. There's always going to be outliers, but do you know how hard it is to put on muscle tissue as a woman? Yes, testosterone is our most dominant sex hormone, but we got about 10 times less than than the guys do. It is,
and they don't get bulky by accident either. They don't get too muscular by accident. Yeah. And they have way more advantages than we do. Nobody's accidentally getting too buff. Okay.
You got to work with an E. You got a WERK to get, that's right. Like, it's hard. It's hard. And you will, if you are, let's say, bulking up, let's say you are the outlier, you're the 1% or whatever, then you can just dial it back.
Exactly. But again, it's not going to, you're not going to wake up one day and be like, I'm a monster who needs to be on, whatever. It's going to, you're going to notice the changes.
You're not going to be green and
no. And the chances are you're going to love those changes when they happen. Like I always say, when people, like, I've had women come up to me in the gym and ask me questions on how to lift weights and how do I keep from getting bulky. And I always tell them, like, you came up to me for a reason, presumably. Like, do you think I'm bulky? You can say it. I have a thick skin. I don't mind. And they'll always say, no, of course not. That's why I, came up to talk to you. And I'm like, I have been working as hard as I possibly can for years upon years upon years and eating a ton of food. And I'm not bulky yet. So again, it's sort of like, just give it a shot. And I love that goes back like full circle to kind of like the playfulness you talked about. This will have to be on another episode where we talk about food, because I wanted to talk about your thoughts on intuitive eating. I know you've spoken about that, and I want to talk about eating animal protein and organ meats. But when you were talking about infusing more play into life, I think that's so important. And it is sometimes easier said than done. Like on one hand, I have this amazing opportunity with a 2-year-old to have more play in my life, because his whole life is about playfulness and exploration. And, but I find myself sometimes being too much like I have to be the parent now, or I have to be worrying about things instead of like immersing myself in it. But the entire reason that I wrote the first book, It Takes Guts, about organ meats, is not just because I think it's important for people to eat the whole animal and to eat animal protein and to eat the best, most nutritious parts of the animal, but because I like to think of trying new things, and especially I think food is a really low barrier to entry, as something that's fun and it's an experience and it's enjoyable. And like you try something new because it's an adventure, not because it's scary. But I think we are so conditioned to believe that something new is scary and unpleasant. And maybe that's an instinctive
thing. Like it's okay to suck also. It's okay to be a beginner.
Totally fine. Because you probably
totally fine.
If you like it, you'll eventually get better and that'll be great, probably. And if you don't like it, you literally are no worse off. You're exactly where you started. So if you try organ meats and you hate all of them, you are not worse off. You've learned something and you've had an experience. Probably you're going to find something you like. It's the same with lifting weights. You know, it's like, let's just enter these things. If you're here, it's because you're interested and you want to make changes. So just enter into it with a spirit of like, let's just try it. You know, let's just give it a shot. And
what's the worst that could happen?
What's the worst that could happen? Okay. We've talked for an hour and a half. I love it.
Oh my Lord.
Right. I know we have to do a part 2. I'm so excited to do a part 2. I want to end this with just a really quick rapid fire question that you can't think about it too long. There's no qualifiers here. I just want to hear your first answer. The one exercise in the gym that you love the most, and
hip thrusters.
Okay. All right. If that's it for the rest of your life, hip thrusters. Okay.
I would do hip thrusters. Oh, for the rest of my life. God. Okay. So
your favorite is hip thrusters.
Favorite. I love pull-ups though. Oh, right.
That's my girl. That's what I want to hear.
Hip thrusters and pull-ups. If I had to, if I had one for lower body, can I make it one for lower body, one for upper body?
Okay.
Actually, you know what? Let me change. I love hip thrusters, but if I could only do one, I would do a squat and a pull-up.
Yep.
Just because the squat hits more. Like the squat's going to get the adductors, it's going to get the quads, it's going to get a few more things. If I only had one, I'd do the squat, barbell squat only. And for upper body, I would do pull-ups until the cows come home.
Okay, next time I come to Toronto, we should get a work in together because you basically just described my favorite workout. So I love it. Stephanie, thank you so much. This has been incredibly, I think, useful, and it sort of just makes me feel better too, because these are a lot of questions that, again, wherever you are in your stage of life as a woman, these are things that are important to all of us and that matter. And it's just good for more people to be having more honest conversations about it. So I really appreciate you doing that with me and taking the time. And again, I have a whole list here of the things we didn't get to. So we'll have to do a part 2. But until then, where can folks learn more about you, get your book, your podcast, everything?
Sure. Yeah. So the free way to sort of start interacting with me is on the podcast. So it's a podcaster as you are. So it's called Better with Dr. Stephanie. We, have weekly episodes there. It talks about all things nutrition and fitness and sex hormones and aging and what it means to be a woman and, mindset and parenting and sex and all the things. I'm relatively active on Instagram. I know that my marketing team wants me to be more.
Welcome.
But I'm there. I'm on Instagram as well. And so you can find me at Dr. First Name, Last Name. So Dr. Stephanie Estima. The book you can find on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere good books are sold. It's called The Betty Body by Dr. Stephanie Estima, named after my podcast listeners, by the way.
Cool.
So the podcast is called Better. And we had fans sort of starting to call themselves Betties. And I was like, how cute is that?
That's pretty cute.
Betties. Yeah. So Betty Body. How else can you interact with me? That's it right now. When I relaunch my sort of more holistic plan, that's going to be in a while because I want to do it right. But I can send you when it's ready. You can amend the show notes or whatever. But those are the places right now.
Awesome. All right. Keep being amazing and inspiring us. Appreciate you. And
this is a delight.
Yeah, let's do it again soon.
Very soon. Yeah.
Okay.